Justice Clarence Thomas had just declared, "I uphold the dignity of the Supreme Court." But the bank records in Jasmine Crockett's hand showed that Thomas had received $2.7 million worth of gifts over the past 15 years. 29 seconds later, America would witness the corruption at its highest court. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on Supreme Court ethics had been scheduled as routine oversight, the kind of procedural theater that generates few headlines and fewer viewers. Justice Thomas had agreed to testify voluntarily, a decision his handlers would later regret as the worst strategic miscalculation in Supreme Court history. For the first hour, it had proceeded exactly as expected. Softball questions from Republican senators about the importance of judicial independence. Predictable challenges from Democrats about the need for stronger ethics enforcement. Thomas delivering rehearsed answers about the sacred responsibility of the judiciary and his unwavering commitment to constitutional principles. He had handled the preliminary questions with practiced ease, his deep voice resonating with judicial authority as he spoke about the weight of his office and his dedication to the rule of law. The cameras captured him in his element, confident, authoritative, untouchable in his lifetime appointment. "The Supreme Court," Thomas had intoned during one particularly pompous response to Senator Ted Cruz, "stands as the final arbiter of constitutional questions precisely because we are insulated from political pressures and financial influences. We serve not the whims of the moment, but the enduring principles of law." The Republican senators nodded approvingly. This was exactly the kind of high-minded rhetoric they wanted for the record, language that would defend the court's legitimacy against Democratic attacks on its ethical standards. Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I've dedicated my entire career to maintaining the highest standards of judicial conduct. I have never, and I want to be absolutely clear about this, never allowed personal relationships or financial considerations to influence my judicial decisions." The applause from the Republican side was immediate and enthusiastic. Senator Lindsey Graham beamed like he had just heard the Sermon on the Mount delivered by Solomon himself. "The dignity of the Supreme Court," Thomas concluded, his voice reaching a crescendo of righteous authority, "depends upon the absolute integrity of its members. That integrity is something I guard jealously and uphold without compromise." It was a masterful performance, the kind of statement that would play well on conservative media and provide ammunition for defenders of the court's current ethical framework. Thomas sat back in his chair, clearly satisfied with his delivery. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't applauding. She was opening a thick manila folder that had been sitting quietly beside her throughout the hearing. "Justice Thomas," she said, her voice cutting through the settling applause like a scalpel, "I appreciate those inspiring words about the dignity of the Supreme Court." Thomas's expression flickered slightly. Not quite concern, but a recognition that the tone had shifted in a way he hadn't anticipated. "Thank you, Congresswoman," he replied carefully. "I have some questions about how those principles applied to your relationship with businessman Harlan Crow." The name landed in the hearing room like a stone in still water. Everyone knew about Harlan Crow, the Texas billionaire whose lavish gifts to Thomas had generated headlines and ethics complaints for years. But Thomas had weathered those storms before, dismissed them as partisan attacks, relied on technical compliance with disclosure rules to deflect criticism. Thomas's media training kicked in immediately. "Mr. Crow is a longtime friend whose generous hospitality I have enjoyed within the bounds of applicable ethics rules." "I see," Jasmine said, her tone maddeningly neutral. "And how would you characterize the total value of that generous hospitality over the past 15 years? The question was a trap, and Thomas knew it. Too low a number would be contradicted by public reporting. Too high would make the relationship look inappropriate. He chose evasion. "I don't think it would be appropriate for me to place a dollar figure on friendship, Congresswoman." "Of course not," Jasmine replied smoothly. "Let me help you with that." She lifted the first document from her folder, a thick stack of papers bound with a black clip. This is a forensic financial analysis commissioned by the Senate Judiciary Committee and conducted by Kroll Associates, the same firm used by the FBI for complex financial investigations. Thomas's face went very still. Kroll Associates wasn't a partisan research group or opposition research firm. They were the gold standard for forensic accounting, the investigators used by federal prosecutors in white-collar crime cases. Their analysis, Jasmine continued, examined all publicly available records, tax filings, and financial disclosures related to benefits you received from Mr. Crow and associated entities between 2008 and 2023. She paused, letting the implications sink in. This wasn't opposition research or media speculation. This was professional forensic investigation with the credibility to withstand legal scrutiny. The total value, she said, her voice steady as bedrock, is $2.7 million. The number hit the hearing room like a physical blow. Not thousands of dollars in gifts, not tens of thousands in hospitality. Nearly $3 million in benefits flowing from a single wealthy individual to a sitting Supreme Court justice. Thomas's mouth opened, then closed. The confident jurist who had spent an hour lecturing about judicial integrity was suddenly confronted with the mathematical reality of his ethical compromises. That figure is grossly inflated and takes many items out of context, he managed, falling back on standard damage control language. Let's examine the context, Jasmine said, reaching for a second document. This is a detailed breakdown of benefits received, organized by category and year. The document appeared on the hearing room's main screens, a professional spreadsheet with dates, amounts, and descriptions that looked like evidence in a federal corruption case. Private jet transportation, $412,000. Luxury yacht vacations, $637,000. Resort accommodations, $398,000. Real estate transactions involving your mother's property, $525,000. Each category landed like another indictment. This wasn't friendship. It was a systematic transfer of wealth from a billionaire to a Supreme Court justice over 15 years. Private school tuition for your grandnephew paid directly by Mr. Crow, $164,000. Luxury car purchases and maintenance, $97,000. Home renovations and improvements, $286,000. Thomas was now visibly sweating despite the cool air conditioning in the hearing room. The confident jurist who had entered that morning was dissolving under the weight of documented evidence. And that's just from Mr. Crow, Jasmine added quietly. The analysis identified benefits from 17 other wealthy individuals and organizations totaling an additional $1.4 million. The silence in the hearing room was absolute. $4.1 million in undisclosed benefits to a sitting Supreme Court justice. Not over a lifetime of service, but concentrated in a 15-year period during some of the court's most consequential decisions. Thomas tried desperately to regain control of the narrative. These are friendships that developed over decades. The suggestion that there's anything improper. Justice Thomas, Jasmine interrupted, her voice sharp with prosecutorial precision. Did you disclose any of these benefits on your annual financial disclosure forms as required by federal law? The question was devastating in its simplicity. Either Thomas had disclosed the benefits, which would make his claims about their modest nature laughable, or he hadn't disclosed them, which would be a violation of federal ethics law. Thomas's mouth moved, but no sound came out. There was no good answer because there was no legal answer that didn't destroy his position. Let me help you again, Jasmine said, reaching for another document. This is your 2019 financial disclosure form, signed under penalty of perjury. The form appeared on screen, an official government document bearing Thomas's signature, and the solemn certification that all information was true, complete, and correct. Under the section for gifts and benefits received, Jasmine said, her finger pointing to the relevant line on the form, you reported $0. Zero. She let that sink in before continuing. This was the same year you took 3 separate luxury vacations with Mr. Crow valued at a combined $247,000. The mathematical impossibility was stark and undeniable. You can't take $250,000 in luxury vacations and report zero benefits on a financial disclosure form signed under penalty of perjury. And 2020, Jasmine continued, pulling up another form. Again, $0 reported for gifts and benefits. This was the year Mr. Crow purchased your mother's property for $525,000, significantly above market value, according to independent appraisals. Thomas was now gripping the edge of the witness table, his knuckles white with tension. The systematic nature of the omissions was becoming clear. This wasn't careless oversight, it was deliberate concealment. 2021, 2022, 2023, Jasmine continued methodically. $0 reported each year, despite receiving hundreds of thousands in documented benefits annually. She set the forms aside and looked directly at Thomas. Justice Thomas, you just told this committee that you have never allowed financial considerations to influence your judicial decisions. But how can we evaluate that claim when you've systematically concealed those financial considerations from public scrutiny? The question hung in the air like an indictment. The issue wasn't just whether Thomas had been influenced by the gifts. It was whether his concealment of them had made it impossible to evaluate potential conflicts of interest. Thomas tried one more time to mount a defense. The ethics rules are complex, and reasonable people can disagree about disclosure requirements. Justice Thomas, Jasmine interrupted, did you consult with ethics experts about your disclosure obligations regarding these benefits? Another trap. If he said yes, why hadn't he disclosed them? If he said no, why hadn't he sought guidance about millions of dollars in benefits from interested parties? Thomas chose silence, which was its own answer. Jasmine reached for her next document, not another financial record, but something that made Thomas's eyes widen with recognition and fear. This, she said, holding up what appeared to be a legal contract, is a consulting agreement between your wife, Virginia Thomas, and Liberty Central, a political advocacy organization founded and funded by Harlan Crow. The revelation hit the hearing room like a lightning strike. This wasn't just about gifts to Thomas. It was about systematic financial relationships between the Crow network and the Thomas family that created multiple streams of financial dependence. The agreement, Jasmine continued, provided Virginia Thomas with a salary of $300,000 annually for what the contract describes as strategic political consulting services. Thomas's face had gone gray. This was information that had never been public, never been reported, never been disclosed on any ethics form. The consulting work, Jasmine read from the contract, included developing litigation strategies for cases likely to reach the Supreme Court level and coordinating with allied organizations on constitutional challenges. The implications were staggering. Thomas's wife was being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars by the same man showering Thomas with gifts to develop strategies for cases that would come before Thomas's court. Justice Thomas, Jasmine said, her voice now carrying the full weight of prosecutorial authority. Were you aware that your wife was receiving $300,000 annually from Mr. Crow for work directly related to Supreme Court litigation? Thomas's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. There was no answer that wouldn't destroy him. Either he knew about the payments and failed to disclose the conflict, or he was ignorant of his own wife's financial relationships with parties appearing before his court. Furthermore, Jasmine continued relentlessly, this contract was active during your consideration of several cases in which Mr. Crow's business interests were directly at stake. She reached for another document, a case file that made Thomas visibly flinch. Citizens United v. FEC decided in 2010. Your vote was crucial in the 5-4 decision that removed restrictions on corporate political spending. Mr. Crow's companies spent $14.7 million on political activities in the election cycle, immediately following that decision. The connection was clear and devastating. Thomas had cast the deciding vote in a case that directly benefited his financial patron, while his wife was receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars from the same patron for political consulting work. Environmental Protection Agency v. Coastal Industries, decided in 2015. Your vote was again decisive in limiting EPA regulatory authority. Mr. Crow's petrochemical investments, valued at over $200 million, were directly affected by this decision. Case after case, decision after decision, Thomas's votes had consistently favored the financial interests of the man who was simultaneously showering his family with millions of dollars in benefits and payments. Voting rights cases, campaign finance cases, environmental cases, business regulation cases, Jasmine listed methodically. In every instance where Mr. Crow's interests were at stake, your vote supported his position. She paused, letting the pattern speak for itself, before delivering the final blow. Justice Thomas, this isn't friendship. This is systematic corruption of the highest court in America. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Thomas sat motionless, his career, his reputation, his legacy crumbling in real time on national television. The Republican senators were frantically whispering among themselves, calculating political damage and trying to figure out how to defend the indefensible. The Democratic senators were taking notes, recognizing that this was no longer routine oversight. It was the exposure of the most significant judicial corruption scandal in American history. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She reached into her folder one final time and withdrew a document that made Thomas's face go completely white. "This," she said, "is a recorded phone conversation between you and Mr. Crow, dated March 15, 2018, 3 days before oral arguments in the case of Morrison versus National Labor Relations Board." The room held its breath. Audio recordings of Supreme Court justices discussing pending cases with interested parties would be nuclear-level evidence of judicial misconduct. The recording, Jasmine continued, was made by Mr. Crow as part of his personal record-keeping practices and was provided to Senate investigators by his former business manager under a whistleblower agreement. Thomas looked like a man watching his entire world collapse. Audio evidence was impossible to deny, impossible to spin, impossible to explain away. Jasmine pressed play on a small digital device connected to the hearing room's sound system. The audio quality was excellent. Professional recording equipment, not a hidden phone app. The first voice was clearly Thomas's, unmistakable in its deep, distinctive tone. "Harlan, I wanted to give you a heads up about the Morrison case. The oral arguments are Monday, but I think you'll be pleased with how this turns out." Crow's voice responded, "That's good to hear, Clarence. The union contracts are costing our manufacturing division about $40 million a year. Any relief would be significant." "I understand completely," came Thomas's voice. "The legal reasoning is solid. Worker organizing has exceeded constitutional boundaries in this area. I think we can bring Roberts and Alito along without much difficulty." The conversation continued for several more minutes, Thomas providing detailed analysis of his colleagues' likely positions, Crow offering specific examples of how the case outcome would benefit his business interests, both men speaking with the casual familiarity of long-standing business partners rather than the careful distance that should exist between a judge and an interested party. When the recording ended, the silence in the hearing room was complete and devastating. This wasn't just the appearance of impropriety or potential conflicts of interest. This was a Supreme Court justice actively coordinating with a financial benefactor about pending cases that would affect that benefactor's business interests. Thomas sat motionless, his face a mask of shock and dawning horror. The confident jurist who had entered the hearing room that morning was completely, irreversibly destroyed. Jasmine spoke into the silence, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the chamber. "Justice Thomas, you told this committee that you have never allowed financial considerations to influence your judicial decisions. The recording we just heard suggests otherwise." Thomas's mouth moved, but no sound emerged. What could he say? How do you defend against your own voice on tape? How do you explain away coordination with financial benefactors about pending cases? "The Morrison case," Jasmine continued, "was decided 5-4, with you providing the crucial fifth vote. The decision invalidated union contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars nationwide and directly benefited Mr. Crow's business interests by approximately $67 million annually. She paused, letting the numbers sink in. $67 million in annual benefit to your financial patron, resulting from a vote you coordinated with him in advance. The committee chairman, a Republican who had been hoping for a routine ethics hearing, looked like he was watching his political future dissolve in real time. This was beyond damage control. This was complete institutional collapse. Thomas made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. That conversation has been taken out of context. You don't understand the full what, Justice Thomas? The full extent of your financial arrangement with Mr. Crow? The full scope of your coordination on cases affecting his interests? Jasmine stood up, her movement commanding the attention of every person in the room. Justice Thomas, you have received over $4 million in undisclosed benefits from interested parties. Your wife has received hundreds of thousands more in payments tied to Supreme Court litigation. You have coordinated with financial benefactors about pending cases affecting their business interests. Her voice carried the weight of moral judgment as she continued. This isn't judicial independence. This isn't constitutional interpretation. This is the systematic corruption of American justice at its highest level. Thomas remained silent, because there was nothing he could say. The evidence was overwhelming. The documentation was irrefutable. The audio recording was his own voice betraying his own corruption. The dignity of the Supreme Court, Jasmine concluded, echoing Thomas's earlier words, depends upon the absolute integrity of its members. Justice Thomas, you have betrayed that integrity, betrayed that dignity, and betrayed the American people's trust in equal justice under law. She gathered her documents methodically, each movement final and decisive. You asked us to trust that financial considerations have never influenced your decisions. But you've systematically concealed those financial considerations from public scrutiny while coordinating with your benefactors about cases affecting their interests. Thomas sat alone at the witness table, surrounded by the wreckage of his judicial career and the damning evidence of his own choices. The lifetime appointment that was supposed to protect his independence had instead enabled his corruption. The hearing was effectively over, though the formal proceedings would continue for several more hours. The real damage was already done, the exposure of systematic corruption that would forever change how Americans viewed their highest court. Within hours of the hearing, ethics complaints would be filed, congressional investigations launched, and calls for impeachment echoing from every corner of the political spectrum. The Supreme Court that Thomas had claimed to protect through his integrity had been gravely wounded by his corruption. But perhaps most significantly, the American people had been given an unvarnished look at how justice really worked at the highest levels of their democracy. They had seen documented evidence that Supreme Court decisions affecting millions of Americans had been influenced by the personal financial interests of the justices making those decisions. The hearing ended not with Thomas's resignation or removal. Those battles would be fought in the months to come, but with the death of the myth that the Supreme Court stood above politics and financial influence. Justice Clarence Thomas had entered that hearing room as a respected member of the highest court in America. He left as the architect of the most significant judicial corruption scandal in the nation's history. The recordings would be replayed on every news channel. The financial documents would be analyzed by every media outlet. The evidence would be debated in law schools and coffee shops across the country. But the core truth was simple and undeniable. America's highest court had been corrupted by money, influence, and the personal greed of its members. And thanks to Jasmine Crockett's meticulous investigation and fearless questioning, that corruption could no longer hide in the shadows of judicial secrecy. The reckoning had come to the Supreme Court, and like all reckonings with the truth, it was long overdue but ultimately inevitable. In the days that followed, as the nation grappled with the implications of what had been revealed, one fact remained clear. The American people deserved better from their highest court. They deserved justices who served the law, not their own financial interests. Whether they would get that justice remained to be seen. But thanks to 29 seconds of devastating questioning and years of meticulous investigation, the American people finally knew the truth about what their Supreme Court had become. And sometimes, the truth is enough to change everything. But the story didn't end in that hearing room. Within hours, the footage was everywhere, not just on news channels, but exploding across social media platforms in ways that traditional political scandals never had before. The audio recording of Thomas coordinating with Crow about the Morrison case became the most shared political clip in internet history, surpassing even the most viral presidential debate moments. The reaction wasn't just political, it was visceral, personal, deeply emotional, in a way that cut across party lines. Americans had always been taught that the Supreme Court was different, special, above the petty corruptions of ordinary politics. To hear a justice casually discussing how to manipulate a case outcome for a financial benefactor's business interests shattered something fundamental in the national psyche. Sarah Martinez, a single mother from Phoenix, who had lost her job due to the Morrison decision's impact on union protections, watched the hearing from her apartment, where she was still struggling to pay rent on her minimum wage replacement job. "I knew something was wrong," she told a local news crew that tracked her down after she posted an emotional video response that went viral. "My union rep kept saying the Supreme Court didn't understand how the decision would hurt working families. Now I know. They understood perfectly. They just didn't care because they were getting paid not to care." Her 18-year-old daughter, Maria, had been filming her mother's reaction to the hearing. The video showed Sarah breaking down in tears as she realized that her family's financial struggles were the direct result of a Supreme Court justice's corruption. "Mom always told me the system was fair if you worked hard and followed the rules," Maria said in the video. She worked 2 jobs, paid her taxes, believed in America, and they sold her out for yacht trips and private jets. The video was shared over 2 million times in the first 48 hours, becoming the human face of institutional betrayal. But it was just one of thousands of similar stories emerging from across the country as people connected their personal struggles to the systematic corruption at the highest levels of government. Meanwhile, in Washington, the political earthquake was just beginning. The audio recording wasn't just evidence of corruption. It was a roadmap to other potentially compromised decisions. Legal scholars and investigative journalists began combing through every major Supreme Court decision from Thomas's tenure, looking for patterns of financial benefit to his benefactors. What they found was even more devastating than what Jasmine had revealed in the hearing. Case after case showed Thomas consistently voting in ways that benefited the business interests of people who had provided him with luxury travel, expensive gifts, or payments to his wife. Dr. Amanda Chen, a constitutional law professor at Georgetown who had clerked for Justice Breyer, published a detailed analysis that became known as the Thomas Papers, a comprehensive examination of how financial relationships had systematically corrupted Supreme Court decision-making. "This isn't just about one corrupt justice," she wrote in the introduction that would be quoted in history books for generations. "This is about the complete breakdown of the institutional safeguards that are supposed to protect judicial independence. When a justice can receive millions of dollars from interested parties while deciding cases that affect those parties' interests, we no longer have a court system. We have an auction house where justice goes to the highest bidder." But the most explosive revelation came from an unexpected source. Eleanor Whitman, Harlan Crow's former personal assistant, who had maintained meticulous records of every gift, payment, and interaction between Crow and the Thomas family for over 15 years. Whitman, now 67, and facing her own mortality after a cancer diagnosis, decided she could no longer carry the weight of what she knew. In an exclusive interview with 60 Minutes, she revealed the existence of what she called the ledger, a detailed record of every benefit provided to Supreme Court justices and their families, cross-referenced with case outcomes and financial impacts. "Mr. Crow kept track of everything," she told correspondent Leslie Stahl, her voice shaking with years of suppressed guilt. "Every gift, every vacation, every payment. And he kept track of the results, how much money each Supreme Court decision saved or made for his various business interests." She paused, gathering strength before delivering the most damning revelation. He called it his investment portfolio. He said Supreme Court justices were the best investment he ever made because the returns were guaranteed and tax-free. The ledger, which Whitman had copied before leaving Crow's employment, contained entries that read like a corruption scorecard. Thomas, private jet to Bohemian Grove, $47,000. Expected ROI, environmental regulations case, ESTine, 200 millimeters impact. Thomas' spouse, consulting payment, $75,000. Related, voting rights case, potential unlimited political spending benefit. Thomas, real estate transaction, above market, $125,000. Target, labor relations decision, ESTine, 500 millimeters annual union impact. Each entry detailed not just the benefit provided, but the expected return on investment through favorable Supreme Court decisions. It was systematic corruption documented with business-like precision. The 60 Minutes interview sent shockwaves through Washington that made the original hearing look like a minor tremor. This wasn't just about Thomas anymore. The ledger contained references to benefits provided to multiple justices, creating the possibility that the entire conservative majority of the Supreme Court had been systematically compromised. Within 24 hours of the broadcast, protests erupted outside the Supreme Court building. Unlike typical Washington demonstrations, these crowds included people who had never protested anything before: suburban families, retirees, veterans, people who had believed in the system until the system revealed its own corruption. The signs they carried were simple but devastating: justice for sale, Supreme Court, supreme corruption, and most frequently, impeach Thomas now. But the most powerful moment came when Maria Martinez, the teenager whose video of her mother's reaction had gone viral, stood on the Supreme Court steps and read a letter she had written to the justices. "Dear Supreme Court," she began, her young voice carrying clearly across the crowd and the television cameras. "My mom always told me that in America, everyone is equal under the law. She said it didn't matter if you were rich or poor, powerful or powerless. The law would treat you the same." She paused, her composure remarkable for an 18-year-old carrying the weight of national attention. "But you taught me that was a lie. You taught me that if you have enough money, you can buy a Supreme Court justice like you buy a car or a house. You taught me that my mom's job, our apartment, our future, none of it matters as much as a rich man's yacht trip." The crowd was silent as she continued. "I'm 18 now, I can vote. And I want you to know that my generation sees what you've done. We understand that you sold our futures for your comfort, and we're not going to forget." She folded the letter carefully and placed it on the Supreme Court steps, where it would be joined by thousands of others over the following days. Letters from Americans expressing their heartbreak over the betrayal of their highest court. Back in the halls of Congress, the political reckoning was swift and bipartisan. Even Republican senators, who had initially defended Thomas, found themselves unable to explain away the audio recording and the detailed financial documentation. Senator Susan Collins, known for her careful approach to controversial issues, delivered a floor speech that captured the mood of institutional crisis. "I have spent my career defending the independence and integrity of our federal judiciary," she said, her voice heavy with disappointment. "But what we learned in the Judiciary Committee hearing isn't about independence. It's about dependence. Dependence on wealthy benefactors. Dependence on luxury gifts. Dependence on financial relationships that compromise the very independence we seek to protect." She paused, the weight of the moment evident in her posture. A Supreme Court justice who coordinates with financial benefactors about pending cases isn't independent. He's bought and paid for. The speech effectively ended Republican resistance to impeachment proceedings. When even moderate Republicans acknowledged that Thomas's behavior was indefensible, the political path forward became clear. The House of Representatives voted to impeach Justice Clarence Thomas by a margin of 287-148, with 45 Republicans joining all Democrats in supporting impeachment. It was the first time in American history that a Supreme Court justice had been impeached, but the evidence was too overwhelming and too documented to allow partisan protection. The Senate trial that followed was unlike anything in American political history. Unlike presidential impeachments, where partisan loyalty often trumped evidence, the case against Thomas was built on audio recordings, financial documents, and detailed testimony from witnesses who had documented every aspect of his corruption. Harlan Crow himself was compelled to testify under subpoena, his usual confident demeanor replaced by the defensive posture of a man whose private business dealings had become public evidence of systematic corruption. Under oath, Crow was forced to admit that he had provided Thomas with over $2.7 million in benefits while expecting favorable treatment in Supreme Court cases affecting his business interests. The admission, delivered in the same Senate chamber where Thomas had been exposed months earlier, effectively sealed the justice's fate. The Senate voted to remove Thomas from office by a margin of 67 to 33, with 17 Republicans joining all Democrats in concluding that his conduct was incompatible with judicial office. For the first time in American history, a Supreme Court justice had been removed for corruption. But the Thomas scandal had broader implications beyond one man's fall from grace. The detailed investigation had revealed systematic problems with Supreme Court ethics that went far beyond any individual justice. Congress passed comprehensive judicial ethics reform with overwhelming bipartisan support, legislation requiring detailed financial disclosure, prohibiting gifts from parties with interests before the court, and establishing an independent ethics oversight body with real enforcement power. More importantly, the scandal had educated the American people about the importance of judicial accountability in ways that decades of civic education had never achieved. Suddenly, Supreme Court ethics wasn't an abstract legal concept. It was a kitchen table issue that affected real families in measurable ways. Law schools across the country reported record enrollment in constitutional law courses. Young people who had never paid attention to the courts were suddenly engaged in judicial politics, recognizing that Supreme Court decisions had direct impacts on their lives, their jobs, their futures. Maria Martinez, the teenager whose letter on the Supreme Court steps had become a symbol of generational change, was accepted to Harvard Law School with a full scholarship. In her acceptance essay, she wrote about wanting to become the kind of lawyer who would prevent future corruption of the judicial system. Justice Thomas taught my generation that the system can be corrupted, she wrote. But Congresswoman Crockett taught us that corruption can be exposed and stopped. I want to be on the side that stops it. 6 months after Thomas's removal, the Supreme Court felt different. The remaining justices, sobered by the scandal and aware of increased public scrutiny, began issuing more detailed explanations of their decisions and more carefully considering the appearance of conflicts of interest. The court's approval rating, which had plummeted to historic lows during the Thomas scandal, began to recover as Americans saw concrete evidence that accountability was possible and that their institutions could reform themselves when forced to confront their failures. Jasmine Crockett, who had triggered the avalanche of accountability with her methodical questioning and devastating evidence, found herself transformed from a relatively unknown congresswoman into a national symbol of institutional reform. But she rejected attempts to make her a political celebrity, instead focusing on the systematic changes needed to prevent future corruption. In a speech at the National Press Club 6 months after the Thomas hearing, she reflected on what the scandal had revealed about American democracy. The Thomas case wasn't just about one corrupt justice, she said. It was about a system that had stopped policing itself, that had allowed the appearance of propriety to substitute for actual integrity. She paused, her words carrying the weight of someone who had seen how power really worked. But it was also about the power of documentation, investigation, and accountability. When we demand evidence, when we follow the money, when we refuse to accept excuses and evasions, corruption can't survive the scrutiny. The audience, filled with journalists who had covered the scandal from beginning to end, understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented in American politics. Not just the fall of a corrupt official, but the successful reform of a corrupted institution. As Jasmine concluded her remarks, she offered a lesson that would echo through American politics for years to come. Democracy doesn't protect itself. It requires constant vigilance, careful investigation, and the courage to hold powerful people accountable for their actions. The moment we stop demanding answers is the moment corruption starts hiding in plain sight. The Thomas scandal had ended, but the precedent it set would live on. Future Supreme Court justices would know that their financial relationships would be scrutinized, their decisions would be analyzed for conflicts of interest, and their conduct would be held to the highest standards. Most importantly, the American people had learned that even lifetime appointments couldn't protect corrupt officials from accountability when the evidence was overwhelming and the political will for justice was strong enough. Justice Clarence Thomas had begun that hearing as a seemingly untouchable member of America's highest court. He ended it as a cautionary tale about the price of corruption and the power of truth to bring down even the mightiest institutions. The dignity of the Supreme Court, which Thomas had claimed to uphold, was ultimately restored not by protecting him from scrutiny, but by holding him accountable for betraying the trust that dignity required. And in the end, that accountability made the court stronger, more credible, and more worthy of the respect that American democracy demanded from its highest judicial institution. The system had been tested, found corrupted, and ultimately reformed. It was a reminder that in America, no one, no matter how powerful, how protected, or how permanent their position, is truly above the law. 29 seconds of devastating questioning had led to the most significant judicial reform in American history. Sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything.